Grandfather was an anachronism. He did not belong in this space and time that I knew him. His wisdom does not fit into modern society, but is a call to wilder times and places where all things are real. Modern time and place had no value in his world, for his world was without limits or time. His world was that of nature and eternity. I doubt if he ever really knew how old he was or any of the political boundaries that defined the place of his upbringing. He was truly one of the ancients, part man, part animal, and mostly entirely spirit. His home was the wilderness, and in wilderness he tested all things. Most of all, he was a searcher of truth, trying to define his world and to preserve the purity. His was a life of grand simplicity that few would ever know, where true riches were defined in beauty and not in the false gods of the flesh. I do not truly know the story of Grandfather's entire life and wanderings. Many things I can only assume. I do know that he wandered throughout his entire life, gathering and preserving the skills of survival, tracking, and awareness. Most of all, searching for the basic truth in spirit. For instance, he did not just teach me the making of a bow and arrow that was used by his people, but in all, the making of 12 types of bows and arrows. His survival skills came from the far reaches of northern Alaska to the Argentine wilderness, from the East Coast to the West Coast and everywhere in between. All of the physical skills that he taught were a composition of the various tribes and cultures that spanned the country, selecting the skills that worked for everyone and not the skills that worked for only a few. So too was his knowledge of philosophy and religion, which was even more expansive than his knowledge of practical skills. Grandfather was born into a small nomadic clan of Lipan Apache sometime in the 1880s, before the Apache people had been fully relocated to the reservations. I can only guess at the specifics of his childhood, about which he was always very vague from the stories he told. The first 2 years of his life, until the horror and butchering of war came from the South and killed most of his family and relatives, were spent in the American Southwest. He was then taken south by his great-grandfather, a revered shaman and warrior, to the seclusion of the trackless desert and mountains. There, with a small group of elders and a few children, he was raised in the old ways. It was a nomadic and simple existence, hidden from the wars that beset the territory and from those who sought to destroy the century-old way of life of the Native Americans. The old ones, seeing the greed and destruction that the whites caused, would not permit anything of the outside world to be taught or used by their people. Theirs was a pure existence of ancient skills and natural wisdom to guide their lives and destiny as a people. When most tribes had fallen prey to the reservations and atrocities of white suppression, Grandfather's people lived free and unfettered. To all but the mountain spirits, it would seem that they did not exist. Grandfather's people developed the skills of survival, stalking, and tracking to absolute perfection, for these skills were necessary to their survival. In their ability to escape detection, they were almost invisible, and the acuity of their awareness kept them safe among the barren rocks and scrub they called home. They deftly moved from one camp to another, leaving free and wild as their ancestors had. The power of their wisdom, worship, and medicine grew with the ascetic life they lived. The world of spirit became the single guiding force and the vision of the small group. Their quest was to live in peace, to walk with the Creator, and to keep the old ways alive. It was a life characterized by an extreme simplicity on both a material and spiritual level. And out of the deepening of an understanding of the spiritual dimensions came the ability to speak a different language, the ability to communicate with each other and the natural forces in a real, forceful, and essential way. Grandfather often spoke of his people, of their teachings and love. To this day, their legacy remains a guiding force in my life. It is very difficult to write a book about Grandfather, not because I do not have enough stories about his life, but rather too many. It is hard to choose those that would fit into any given book. I see now that it would take several books just to cover the most important experiences of his life, and still that would not even come close to covering them all. It becomes a frustrating task to figure out which stories would fit into this book. Alas, I could only choose those that create his most basic philosophy of wilderness and spirit. There is so much more involved in the fabric of his consciousness, so much detail I was forced to leave out. An obstacle came to me in the telling of these stories because they are secondhand. I have assumed much in the retelling. The only thing I feel comfortable with is the fact that when Grandfather told us a story, he didn't just tell it, he relived it with all the emotion and detail. When he told a story, we too became part of that story and felt much of what he was feeling. The Native American people were such grand storytellers, and I am honored that I have been a student of one of the best storytellers. Still, it is so very difficult to retell someone else's life story, no matter how hard I try. There is always the probability of something being left out or not stressed enough. Another difficulty with retelling a story about Grandfather is that he was locked into the keen perception and sensitivity to the world of nature and spirit. I'm sure that no matter how much he relived a story, he had to have left so much of the experience out. I'm reminded of his incredible observation powers almost on a daily basis. For most people, a short walk in the woods was just that, but to Grandfather, it was an experience rich with natural wonders and spiritual rapture. We couldn't walk 10 feet together without Grandfather pointing out to me countless things that I had missed on a physical level. The things I used to miss on a spiritual level were even more exasperating. This leads me too often to wonder how many of those things that Grandfather left unmentioned in his stories. Without these things, I feel that I cannot do his experience justice. The writing of this book has been one of my most difficult tasks. It is not just the countless hours going through my dusty old journals that help jog my memory, and it isn't the fact that I had to return so often to the place in the Pine Barrens, New Jersey, where the stories were once told. It is mostly the fact that I feel guilty for attempting to tell his story, and guilty because I know that I cannot do it justice. So, too, is the guilt about making the wrong choices for the stories included in this book. All I can do is rely on what my heart tells me to do, and then do the best I can. Many readers and students ask me why I now chose to write a book about some of Grandfather's life. After 14 years of teaching and 12 books, I feel that it will answer many of the questions as to where the philosophy and the skills that I teach originated. Grandfather, after all, was one of the biggest influences in my life, and how he learned his skill is more important than how they were passed on to me. His skills and philosophy were not strictly of the Native American culture, but a result of his wanderings and searching. For me, it was important to know how he arrived at the conclusions he did and the circumstances and teachers surrounding this enlightenment. My books, The Tracker, The Search, and The Vision have dealt with some of my life story. The numerous field guides on tracking survival and awareness deal with the various skills needed to take someone back to the wilderness and become, once again, a child of the earth. The quest and the journey deal primarily with the philosophy of wilderness and the deeper spiritual quests. Finally, Grandfather brings us all together as it lightly touches some of the origins of these teachings. It will give my readers and students alike a greater understanding of who this man, Stalking Wolf, was, and the ultimate impact he had on my life and on the lives of so many others.